This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Pauline Carr and I'm the Chancellor of the University of South Australia. Tonight it feels like we are surrounded by old friends, and I welcome all of you. Before we begin, let me introduce you to a particular friend of the University of South Australia. Uncle Lewis O'Brien AO is an alumnus of ours and an adjunct research fellow in the Division of Education, Arts and Social Sciences. Among his many accolades last year, he was honoured at the 2018 Australian Council for Educational Leaders National Conference as a recipient of the ACEL Leadership Award. Tonight, Uncle Lewis is going to welcome us to country.
Maruichanga, Gana Mina no Wangani, Mani the Bundi Gana Yatana, Naibirico, Mankalaka, Tandanya, Mianaku, Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yaklandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. I see Uluru is in the papers again, because they brought in about climate change. Don't climb the rock.
Thank you, Uncle Lewis. Our speaker, Mr. Bill Kelty AC, Professor David Lloyd, Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Australia, Ms. Blanche Dalpouge, Ms. Jill Saunders, Members of State Parliament. Unfortunately, Hawke Centre patrons Sir Eric and Lady Neil and Professor Lowicha O'Donoghue are able to attend tonight, but send their best regards. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us here tonight as we present the first Hawke Lecture following the very sad passing of our beloved Bob Hawke back in May this year. It is in his spirit that tonight we continue the tradition, not as a memorial to an individual, but in celebration of a unique individual who made an enormous difference to many lives. Bob's wife Blanche is with us here tonight, as is his longtime associate and friend Jill Saunders. And I know that you will all welcome them back to the Adelaide family. We're with you, Blanche and Jill. You are part of us now, part of our ongoing commitment to honouring Bob's work and values as we promote open debate and discussion in the community to reflect our themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity, and building our future. Tonight, we're going to hear from one of Bob Hawke's oldest friends and most important collaborators, a man who followed Mr. Hawke into the Australian Council of Trade Unions and has stayed true to the Hawke's vision for this country. Because of its importance, the session tonight is being recorded, so if you haven't already done so, please turn your phones to silent. I hope you will enjoy tonight's lecture as Bill Kelty tells Bob Hawke's story and his desire to advance Australia and the world. Bob's passing in May brought to an end his grand plans for a nation, leaving unfinished business such as climate change and a treaty with First Nation peoples. Mr. Kelty is also going to share his own views on the future. But before that, allow me to introduce you to Professor David Lloyd, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of South Australia. Thank you.
I didn't make it up the stairs fast enough. Good evening, everybody. The former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating called Bill Kelty AC an anti-narcissist. And that trait is probably necessary if you're going to, as Bill Kelty did, devote your entire working life to working people. An alumnus of La Trobe University, he graduated with a Bachelor of Economics degree, and he took his degree straight to the Federal Office of the Federated Storemen and Packers Union, where he worked as an industrial officer. I mention La Trobe because Bill attended the university at the same time that the ex-Westpac CEO David Morgan studied there. While at La Trobe, Morgan was a star, the foundation president of the sports union, the foundation captain of the football team, and also captain of the university's first cricket team. The very picture of university success, you might think. And yet, it was Bill who won the university medal. And according to Paul Keating, David Morgan never got over it. After a stint with the Storemen and Packers Union, Bill became a research officer for the Workers' Education Association here in South Australia. Then the talent scouts of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU, found him and put him to work as its research officer and industrial advocate. Now, around 20 years before this, Bob Hawke had joined the ACTU as a research officer, and having risen to become the responsible for wage arbitration, he was elected ACTU president in 1969. Bob's patronage of the young Bill Kelty led to Kelty's rapid advancement to the role of Assistant Secretary in 1977, and he became the ACTU Secretary in 1983, shortly after Bob Hawke resigned to enter federal politics. Paul Keating was effusive in his praise. Bill Kelty, he said, is talented but also believes in things. He believes in justice and equity. He has an image of the world which he wants to inhabit and of the society that he wants to live in. And, added Keating, he has the qualities of leadership to drive towards that vision. As ACTU Secretary through the Hawke-Keating years, Mr Kelty worked closely with government to transform the Australian economy through the Prices and Incomes Accord, that historic compact between Labour's political and industrial wings during the Hawke-Keating years that was dedicated to economic growth and job creation. The agreement covered every area of domestic policy, but critical to its success was the union acceptance of wage restraint in exchange for job creation. This was a shift in emphasis by unions from money wages to the social wage, and opened the way for national healthcare and superannuation. Bill Kelty has said that Bob Hawke and Paul Keating were responsible for some of the greatest labour reforms in the history of the country, including Medicare, national superannuation, the minimum wages system, the increase in education expenditure, and action to combat discrimination against women. But Bob Hawke never stopped being concerned with and for Australians. Even at the end of his days, he thought tackling climate change and a treaty with First Nations people were Australia's unfinished business. In his last visit to Bob, Kelty and Hawke talked about our tiny planet in this immense universe and living in a continent inhabited by Indigenous people for 50,000 years. Looking after the planet, respecting Indigenous people with their long history, and making sure that we maintain the social democratic model that was the framework for their last discussion. I will now let Bill tell you about the rest. Please join me in welcoming William John Bill Kelty, AC.
It gives me great pleasure to be here. Let me start by talking about a wonderful person who's not here tonight, and that's Lloyd Donoghue. The ACTU Congress in 1997, Lloyd got up in front of 1,000 delegates in the Brisbane Town Hall, and she talked wonderfully and simply and beautifully about Indigenous culture and what it meant in this world. 1,000 delegates stopped talking, and you could hear people breathing. You could actually hear people breathing. A wonderful speech from a wonderful person about the role of our First People. And it's my job then to get up and respond to what was the best speech that perhaps has ever been given at an ACTU Congress in the history of that organisation. And I thought to myself, why is it so hard not to recognise people who had thousands of generations here caring and loving the place? Why is it so hard? when we've just been here a handful of generations. And it is that message that has stuck with me forever from that moment. To make clear that every time I had an opportunity, I would be a champion to the last minute of my life for Indigenous people, as Bob was for his life. Bob would always say to me, Bill, when you're going to talk to any group of people, make it absolutely clear what you're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about Bob, his philosophy, and the unfinished business. So let there be no lack of clarity about what I'm going to talk about. Let me first talk about Bob. A book came out in the 1980s. It was Leone Kramer and Trevor Kennedy and Richard Walsh. They put together this book, The 50 Men and Women Who Have Shaped the Country. The leaders, the heroes, the larrikins and the visionaries. Bob wasn't in it. I don't think he was surprised that he wasn't in it in the 1980s, but he'd be very surprised if he wasn't in it now. Because if there's ever a title to explain somebody, that explains Bob. He was always a leader. Even when he wasn't the leader of the country, he was always a leader, you can rest assured. I never walked into a meeting where Bob was not the leader. We never did anything where Bob was not the leader. He was a leader by instinct and a leader by character and a leader by commitment. But he was a hero. So people sometimes forget what the 1960s were like in terms of wages. Bob Hawke was the advocate, getting a wage increase for everybody. For everybody. When the national wage came out, it was a wage increase for everybody. So Hawke was a hero, getting a wage for everybody. He was our hero when he said, I'm going to fight for Nelson Mandela. And I don't care what laws I break, and I don't care who I upset. We will be fighting for Nelson Mandela to the day that he gets out of prison. And he was our hero when the French decided to test nuclear weapons in the Pacific. And he said, you can do that if you like, but just remember this, that we will ban you and fight you until you stop testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific. He was our hero. He was a person who motivated us and gave us aspiration, and he gave us inspiration. He was our hero, unreservedly a hero. But he was a larrikin. Now, there's lots of stories you can tell about him being a larrikin, and you have to vet in terms of what he can say and can't say. But I do remember this story, which I probably can tell without too much offence. I'd only been to work for the ACTU, straight from the Storemen and Packers Union, in 1974. We just got back from work early in January. We hadn't had a lot to do, so we decided we'd go for an early lunch at the Duke of Kent. Now, Bob was a very good drinker. As Henry Lawson said, he had this unquenchable capacity for thirst and a short gullet, so he could drink and drink and drink. So we were at the Duke of Kent, and somebody rang up and they said, you've forgotten something, Bob. You forgot to go to the Storemen and Packers Union picnic. Now, bearing in mind it was the Storemen and Packers Union that got him over the line to be president, well, that was a commitment you have to meet. So we went out to Frankston, and there were 2 camels. And they said to Bob, would you get on the camel? I said, Bob, I'm not sure you get on a camel, mate. Look at the camel. He said, I'm getting on the camel. He got on the camel, and the pictures were taken. Photographers took them. Then the camel ran away. Now, if you've never seen a camel run, they can actually run very, very fast. And it was running around Frankston cricket ground. Bob was struggling to hold on, and he finally held on. He got on, and luckily for him, the camel came back. And Bill Land, you and I were sitting there thinking of the next day's headlines across the Melbourne Sun: future Prime Minister lost to a camel. We were petrified, to be honest, we were petrified. Anyway, Bob got back, and he got off the camel. And he said, and you've got to fill in the adjectives. Something camel. He said, I'll never get on a camel again. Something camel. And he said, that camel trainer, he said he must be a member of the Liberal Party. And it's true. So we went back to the ACTU completely refreshed, completely sobered, with one lesson in history: never get on a camel. Now, I thought about that. I could never imagine Malcolm Fraser on a camel. And Paul Keating, who I love dearly, I actually can't ever think of seeing Paul Keating on a camel. And I don't think John Howard would get on a camel. And he was a larrikin, but he was visionary. He was smart, mate. He was super smart. We sit there in November the 12th, 1975. The nation is in uproar. The unions are calling for national disputes. This is the biggest thing ever happened in the democracy of this country: the dismissal of a Prime Minister. We're all waiting for Bob. We're at the ACTU waiting for Bob to get back, and he walks in, and just a few of us, I said, what are we doing, Bob? Are we having a national dispute, or what are we doing? He said, I've been thinking about it. He said, Fraser will win the next election, but because he has been so divisive, it will kill him forever. He will never be an effective Prime Minister. The Labor Party cannot win for 2 terms. This will enable the unions to reconsolidate their position in terms of wages, to get out of the wage explosion. He said, I will be a person of consensus. I will be a person who brings a nation together, and we will win in 2 or 3 terms, and I will be the Prime Minister, and the union movement will regroup. In just a handful of minutes, he determined the Labor Party strategy for 3 years, 5 years, he determined the union strategy for 5 years, and he determined his own political strategy. And that's the strategy we followed. And we followed it to a T forever, and that's what we did. He was a visionary. He was a visionary. Now, the ACTU executive was our forte. We nearly always won. We always had persuasive effect. We always had a process by which we dealt with the issues. And Bob would always go last. Charlie Fitzgibbon would go third last. And I would go second last, in order to make sure we threw the whole assault at those opposing our positions. The most difficult debate we ever had was about the Russian invasion into Afghanistan. And we had almost lost. This is unbelievable that the union movement, who so strongly opposed the United States' involvement in the war in Vietnam, would be so weak when it came to the Russian involvement in Afghanistan. It was as close as we ever came to losing, until Bob made a brilliant speech. And it was a speech about the Soviet Union. And the speech that he made in 1980 was to say the Soviet Union is some artefact, an imperialist source of power. The communism will collapse, and so will it. The Soviet Union will collapse in our lifetime, and this is their last hurrah into Afghanistan. Now, nobody believed that the Soviet Union would collapse then. Nobody. Nobody was writing about it. Nobody was talking about it. but Bob was outlining the vision for what was happening. And we did win the debate. He won the debate. He won the debate. It was brilliant, and it was incisive, and it was visionary. The Soviet Union did collapse. It did collapse and returned to what it was, and turned to these authoritarian, in part, nation states. This is a person of just sheer genius, a visionary, a hero, a leader, and a larrikin. So let me come to Bob. Now, I can only put Bob from my perspective, through my prism. And I don't necessarily say it's the best, and it's certainly not the only one you can see. But Bob, for me, was incredibly special. And he had a set of qualities and characters. And he had a set of philosophy and ideology which governed him. He was totally predictable if you apply what you believe to be his experience. The first was in wages. Here's this young bloke, goes to Oxford, writes his thesis, a brilliant thesis on wages, typed by Hazel. You cannot understand Bob Hawke, cannot understand his contribution to this country, certainly his contribution to industrial relations, until you read this argued piece about the role of prices in the economy when it comes to adjusting wages. It determined his position and his argument for the best part of 25 years. I must have heard it 30 or 40 times myself, listening to Bob argue persistently these two propositions about wages. Firstly, wages must be adjusted as a base in accordance with prices. That's the key to ensuring that the starting point in terms of wages was a real one. The second is that unions had the right to bargain. And out of the bargaining in terms of the increased productivity of a nation, they could distribute it in a variety of ways, but the essential condition to make the system work was unions had the right to bargain. And bargaining was part of this system in a social democratic sense. The key to Hawke's advocacy throughout the whole of the 60s and through the whole of the 70s, those two principal positions. And I heard him argue it in case after case, and he believed it passionately. The second was, he's a very competitive person, Bob, just in case you didn't know. He hated losing, and he did everything to win, from playing cricket to even playing indoor cricket in the ACTU. Bill Hayden wandered in one day, and Bob said, "You field over there." And Bob hit the ball. Rob Jolly made a brilliant catch, but Bob wouldn't go out. He said to Bill Hayden, "Are you sure he's caught it?" Bill said, well, I don't know. I think he caught it. Anyway, he wanted to win. A very competitive character. But he also believed in competition. As president of the ACTU, he'd come to this view, that we can increase wages, we can get 3%, 4%, but we lose it almost straight away as prices go up, then we go round for the next wages. We're always battling to make sure that we improve our wages. So an economy should work better when there's competition. This is a very unusual proposition for a Labor Party leader, and it was certainly a very, very unusual proposition for the president of the ACTU. But it was not theoretical. The attack on retail price maintenance was about competition. The ability to have increased competition in the travel industry was about lowering the prices for people. It's about competition. We thought we would introduce discount petrol into the country, and the New South Wales Transport Union decided to ban us. That is, the union decided to ban the ACTU trying to provide cheaper petrol to working people. Well, Bob got most upset about that proposition. So he said to the TW, organise a meeting of members, and they did. They didn't organise a few. We went into the Paddington Town Hall that was packed to the rafters. 700, 800 people. The oil companies paid for everybody to go because they were keen on the alternative proposition. Bob sat there and he argued two positions. The first was that working people will be better off with competition. And the second, he argued that the oil companies had disguised their profits for a long time, with the exception of Ampol, and if they were really that interested in the welfare, then they would be giving bigger wage increases to you and shorter hours a week. And he said, by the way, we still should get them, and Bill's here to help you get them. And against all the odds, Hawke won. He won by 20 votes, but he won. He believed in competition. He was competitive. Now, nobody wishes to glorify this and make it sound nice, because sometimes it's not. And when Bob Hawke decided that his principal competitor to be Prime Minister was no longer Malcolm Fraser, because he had his measure, but was Bill Hayden, who he didn't quite have his measure, then you saw Bob Hawke at his toughest, hardest, determined to win. It was brutal. It was brutal. He wanted to win, and he did win. Bob was an internationalist. When he took over as president of the ACTU in 1970, he said, you've got to remember you're following Albert Monk. Albert Monk, one of the great unsung heroes of the Australian political life. It is not that well known that Albert Monk had a great personal friendship with Harold Holt. They had tremendous mutual respect. Harold Holt thought that he was an essential ingredient of Australia, a multicultural nation that had the union welcoming and working to make sure that people were welcomed in a multicultural Australia. And Albert Monk was a linchpin of that. And it was wonderful. And when Harold Holt died, according to Bob, Albert Monk cried. So it was an unusual relationship of political comradeship, although political differences, about something which was greater than either of them, and that's a multicultural nation. So when Bob went to the ILO, he was stepping in the footsteps of a great person, Albert Monk. But George Pleiades and Doug Poulter and Barry Watchorn from the department and the employers said when Bob went to the ILO, he was a star. He was the superstar of the ILO. He walked onto the stage, and from that stage he argued against apartheid. He argued against the French testing nuclear weapons. He argued for the rights of working people wherever they are. He argued for the United States as a great democratic force, and he argued against authoritarian nations wherever they were, and he argued as strongly and as passionately against Russia's involvement in Afghanistan as he did for the United States involvement. He was the superstar. Apparently he had a bit of fun too, but he was the superstar. The man from that international stage was an internationalist and believed that international strategies were essential ingredients for a democratic society. He was all of those things. He was very compassionate. I saw him cry. I saw him cry lots of times. And the tears were never for himself, but always for those who had missed out. He cared about people. He was passionate and compassionate. He was the champion of change. We saw Dexter Dunphy give Boyer lectures in 1972 on the challenge of change. And Bob loved it. Bob said, a society which is changing exponentially. Then what you've got to be is on the wave of change, not be swept over the wave or under the wave. You've got to be at the point of the wave. You've got to be with change and promoting change and leading change and reforming societies. And he loved the quote, and he used it all the time, about the exponential rate of change. When we got to power, and we say we collectively got, because you had some sense of ownership in it, but it's essentially a Labor Party, that drove him to make the big changes, and the big changes quickly. The big changes and big changes quickly. And finally, he was an Australian. He loved Australia. He loved that sense of Australia. You would sit and talk about the great writers, the Henry Lawsons and the Banjo Pattersons and the Mary Gilmore. He loved them. And he would love the Heidelberg School. He loved what Australia represented. He loved that sense of larrikinism and the difference, and he promoted it. And of course he loved one of the other authors of great note, Blanche. But of all the politics and the art and the music, the thing he loved most was this. He said to me, Bill, I found this quote from Lenin. He said, Lenin, sitting in a little hotel room in Paris, has been required to write a discourse about why the Australian way of life is not a proper way to go. Here is Lenin writing about the Australians had developed a third way. The Liberal Party had rejected the extremes of the right. The Labor Party had rejected the extremes of the left. We had decided 100 years before Tony Blair had thought about it to actually go the right way. And he said, this is Australia. Here is a nation which is giving a vote to the women in 1901, which is forging agreements between unions and employers in 1905 and 1906, developing better wage systems and social welfare outcomes, and developing the best paid people in the whole of the world, and leading the rest of the world to such an extent that one of the great intellects of the left has to play it down. He said, that's why we're special. And that's why we were special. The Labor Party has done a lot. One of the things it did was produce half the leaders of the early Liberal Party, yes. That's where they all came from. They all came from us, including Sir Robert Menzies, who actually didn't come from us, but he did work for us on a great number of occasions. No wonder they thought we were different. No wonder they thought this strange country called Australia, going a third way, was a bit different. No wonder the revolutionaries on both sides thought, well, this is an unusual country where the employers and unions could actually talk, and there's higher wage rates and better conditions and better social welfare. This is a pretty special place. And he loved that sense of Australia being the third way, the third political force, a social democratic force that could work collectively with people. You could have your arguments and your fights, but you're still one. It was something that drove him passionately. He just loved this sense of Australia. So Bob did all of those things. He did all of those things. So let me come to a couple of points. The transformation with Hawke and Keating. Australia was no easy place in the 1970s, early 1980s. Australia had an unemployment rate of over 10%, inflation of over 10%. We just had a recession which obliterated hundreds of thousands of jobs from the manufacturing sector, obliterated it. We had 12 women in Parliament, 12 women in Parliament. We had one woman on the ACTU executive. Only 33% of Australians reached year 12. Only 33%. We had 300,000 people going to university. Only 18% of Australians thought land rights was a good thing. Land rights was a good thing. We had 30% of men had superannuation, 10% of women had superannuation. We just got unpaid maternity leave for women, And the employer said it would bring the whole economy down, and society will collapse now that women have this right to get unpaid maternity leave. This was a society that had made great advances, and I'm not dismissing the past, but this was no enchanting society. A country going nowhere. A country going nowhere but backwards. Until we had a commitment to try to do something. Now, let me just talk briefly about what you had to do. Bob took this view about the economy and this view about the business. The economy is changing so dramatically that we can cling on to the past. We can hang on by our toenails and our fingernails, hoping that the world somehow will look after us, or we could get on and make the changes. Get on and say that they're not actually waiting for us to make the changes. The world's changed. And when you think of what happened to the Australian economy, Bob Hawke talked about the tourist industry, and people laughed. That will never be a real industry. That's a joke, that industry. When Bob Hawke talked about the wine industry being a leading exporter, people said, Bob's back on the grog, mate. I've got to tell you back, he's back on the grog. And the universities, he said, university will one day be a great industry. People said, he's crazy. He's crazy. When old Tories of good, decent value went to Hawke and Keating and said, you know, we would like to develop the oil and gas basins in very deep part of the world, northwest. Keating and Hawke said, that's right, how do we do it? How do we do this? When Peter Abel said, we want to restructure the transport industry to make it a better place, he said, how do you do it? How do you do it? And of course, a lot of changes were made, dramatic changes for the Labor Party. I got this lecture from Paul Keating once. I wasn't so keen on deregulating the airline industry. You know, I'd represented them for 16 or 17 years. I was the negotiator. So one day I was sitting there and buddy Bob gets into me and Paul gets into me and they say to me this, go to the airport, Bill. Go to the airport. Next time you're at the airport, just look round. Look round at all the working people. You know, they've all got suits on. Working people got suits on. He said they're going on their annual holiday. Some of them, but for most of them, they're going on their life holiday because $1,000. You have to save for 5 years to go to the Gold Coast. You never think of going overseas. He said, what do you want to do, mate? Well, I'm an old working class boy, you know, like, what do? You deregulate the airlines, make it more competitive, give working people an opportunity to travel. You privatise things, not because you like privatisation, but you've got to get an energy and a commitment and a substance in the way in which goods and services are produced in the world, which are better and more effective, and you enable the country to be more dynamic. So these were the dynamic promoters and supporters of rapid adjustment in a society to make it better. They were incredible. Now, people tell us this, that, Bill, it's no use harping about the past. Don't go back. Don't talk about just the past. 2019 is not 1980. Something I think I actually do understand it's not 1980. I actually understood that. I understand that the country has a national healthcare system which is better. I understand we've got a better wages system. I understand we've got national super. I've got to understand that we have created 5 or 6 or 10 of the most important companies in Australia in the back room of the ACTU. I actually do understand a bit different. It's actually a bit different. But it is not that different. It's not that different. We've made a lot of progress. We made a lot of progress with Labor government and some good decisions from Liberal governments too. We shouldn't be ashamed of the progress the nation has made. We should understand from where it came from, and it came from good people making hard decisions on both sides of the political. Now, people say to me, you're a lifelong Labor Party supporter, but how come one of your best ever friends in political life is Ian McPhee, who worked for the Liberal Party? I say because friendship is people believe in things, and they could be Labor Party or Liberal Party. In a sense, it doesn't matter that much. You believe in good things and good values, and you work to achieve that. But it's not that different today. We've got a society in which, since the GFC, real wage rates have hardly improved for most working people. Hardly improved for most working people. We had the government defer the superannuation. Even our own people could only muster up enough courage to get it up 0.25%. 0.25%. I gave one a bit of a hard serve the other day, and people said you were wrong. I said, well, I don't know. I only increased super by 0.5%. No, he didn't increase super. Paul said, actually, he didn't increase super by 0.5%, only increased it by 0.25% in terms of it. We have people out there today on the edge of life. People don't know how hard it is. You're on $40,000 or $50,000 trying to raise your children. You've got a marginal tax rate of 32.5%. You pay the GST. You've got to pay your HECS back. They actually struggle. They actually struggle in terms of today's society. It is no easy task for a lot of people out there. We have no climate change policy. We've got no energy policy. We've got no wages policy. Don't tell me it's that much different. It's not as bad, but it's not that much different. And good people from both sides of the political equation have tried desperately to take Australia out of the rut, to take it out of the mediocrity in which we are mired. We are mired in this mediocrity, and the economy has stalled, and we are starting to live with it. It's a terrible thing to live with mediocrity, because in a year or two we can all live with mediocrity. In a generation we pay an enormous price, an enormous price. So let me come to the relevance of Labor. Labor Party is good at doing lots of things, but surprisingly is not that good at winning elections. I have noted. And sadly, I have noted this. I was born in 1948. Labor Party has won clearly 8 elections, and by minority government won. Bob won 4 of them. He won 4 of those elections. So we're not that good at winning elections. And in the period of government since I was born, we've only have majority power 19 years of that period, less than 1/3. Less than 1/3 of that time. And of course we have made, and the Labor Party did make, in conjunction with some very good other people from all sides of the political equation, some bold decisions. And it is probably not news to you. We actually lost the last election. We lost that election. So people say to me, there's nothing in Hawke anymore. There's nothing in Keating anymore. They were people of the past. Let me just say this. Let me take you to every one of those values and perspectives to which I outlined and see whether they are relevant for the future. We have a wages system in which real wage rates are stagnating. Stagnating. We've had no improvement in real wage rates for the overwhelming majority of people for a long time. For a very long time. Now the Reserve Bank, and I was once a member of this very nice body, thinks that wages is not such a problem because unemployment falls to 4.5. Out of the genie, a 4.5% unemployment will become this magic elixir called the solution to wages. I can tell the Reserve Bank there are no genies. The wages system is not working as effectively as it should for 3 reasons. The minimum rate adjustment are good, but they can be just a bit higher into the time. Secondly, enterprise bargaining is no longer working. It's not working because unions don't have the right to bargain as effectively and cleanly as they should. Now, saying this government has got a solution to all these problems of industrial life. Now, I might be wrong, but I think industrial disputation is the lowest on record. The lowest on record. So people are contemplating a very unusual system called a point system. A point system. That's a great system. I don't know how many points I would have got under that system. I think I would have got a lot of points. And I don't know how many points Bob Hawke would have got, but he would have got more than me. Because when you stop a country because you believe in Medicare and fight to get Medicare, and you stop every place you can, and when you put bans on the French to stop them testing, and when you're supporting Nelson Mandela, then I tell you what, you're going to be accumulating a hell of a lot of points in this system. So rather than concentrate on what is wrong with the system, at the lowest level of industrial disputes in history, where unions are actually struggling to get a wage increase. It's not as if they're out there getting these huge wage increases. We are not, as a nation, looking at the fundamental problem why. The wages system doesn't work as effectively as it should, but the underlying system, that is the underlying economic growth of this nation, has to be improved and distributed more effectively. This is a world fundamentally changing. This is changing so dramatically. As we look at what will happen, it will be laughable when people talk in 2050 of what we did today. Nothing. Jobs are being restructured and changed every day. Now, if you want any reference points, let me go to 2 people who were not some left-wing ratbags, not in the armoury of the Socialist Revolutionary Group, are not scriptwriters for Jeremy Corbyn, but scriptwriters for good public policy. Piketty on capital, and Adair Turner, an old Tory, mind you, who has believed and stated that the economy is shifting so fundamentally with artificial intelligence, the workforce is being so restructured, that what is happening as artificial intelligence takes over, then what you're going to see smaller groups of highly paid people with very good jobs, and you're going to have this huge growth of the service sector and security. Now, it's all right to talk in theoretical terms. It's all right to say yes, but they're just pieces of work, Bill. Don't worry too much about them. Don't get too excited and agitated. After all, you were never such a great lover of academic treatises to form your view. I just say, just look at 2 things. Superannuation performances are 9%. Super funds are growing at 9% because the rate of return on capital is increasing. But wage rates are only growing at 1%. So that says Piketty's right. He's absolutely right about where this world is going. And if you don't think that there's some fundamental reshaping of the workforce, just think of what is happening in terms of workplace after workplace after workplace. Now, I know this, that there won't be one warehouse in Australia. There won't be one warehouse in Australia in 2030, 2040 that's not an automated warehouse. Not one. And what you're going to have is fewer people, highly skilled process working, and high level of security. Example after example, which says this is the world in which we're in. So what should we do? We should embrace change. Sit down and work out the most effective levels of training. Invest in education. Unions and employers should be working together to increase productivity and adaptation in order to increase wages, in order to increase growth, so that we increase productivity to share it effectively. Do you think for one moment, if Bob Hawke was not the Prime Minister, if he was the Prime Minister of Australia today, that we wouldn't be before him talking about those three things, fixing the minimum rate, fixing enterprise bargaining, and trying to work together to make a more productive, adaptive nation? Wages is important, but we don't have a wages policy. We don't have a wages policy. Superannuation increased to 12% with an infrastructure class is a Keating-Hawke strategy. In order to say, this is an old conservative policy thrift. You save for the future. You save for the future. There's nothing Labor in this. This is just people making a rational decision to say, if you want a better retirement system in the future, start planning to pay for it now. If we increase it to 12%, keep the commitment and make sure there's a proper infrastructure class. We've got a world today in which there's trillions of dollars of debt. One quarter of the government debt trades at negative rates of return. 1/4, mind you. 1/4 trades at negative rates of return. The German bond market, the German government only 2 weeks ago put out for a 10-year instrument negative coupon of 0.65. That is, I'll invest in German bond knowing I'll lose almost 1% a year for 10 years. Now that's either a sign that they're preparing for a terrible, terrible world, and people would rather have 90% than 100%. Or it says that the world's capital markets are so shaken up and so changing, they've changed now for 5 or 10 years. Now, the President of the United States has done some good service and some bad service. I think most people would agree on that. The good service is this: he's completely destroyed the Tea Party in the United States. You remember the Tea Party used to chant, debt is bad, debt is bad. You remember, debt is bad, debt is bad. So Trump has come along and said, I've got a solution for you. I've decided to double the debt. They now chant, debt is good, debt is good. They're finished. He has finished them off. He's completely destroyed them. He's done a better job than Hillary Clinton would have done, a much better job in destroying the Tea Party. Nobody has destroyed them more effectively than him. But the other thing, of course, he's done is reduced one of the great financial institutions and stability of the world, the Federal Reserve, into a note-printing branch. You can't increase the rates. You can't increase the rates today or tomorrow or next year or 3 years' time. It just simply can't do it. Because if it does do it, giving the huge burden of debt that is incurred in the US economy, the US economy will collapse. So what they now do is come to work each day and say, how can we print more money? We are now the note-printing branch of the US Reserve. That's what we now do. Now, it is dangerous. It is very dangerous. Our best protection as a nation is to invest in our own superannuation. The other thing, of course, is to accept not all our ideas are good ideas, and not all the Liberal Party ideas in government are bad ideas. The Future Fund is a fantastic idea. It truly is a fantastic idea for a nation to invest and save. We should be expanding it, not reducing it. Or even let it compete with super funds. But not even the government seems to like that. It seems to me the only people who want the Future Fund to be available to workers to invest in is Peter Costello, Paul Keating and me. But we do, because it's actually a good idea and an essential idea in a dynamic economy. If you think the tax system is fair, then I just asked you to ponder this. Now, in a recent campaign, there's a lot of talk about the top end of town. And I said to one of the people in our party, you've got to remember this, mate, about the top end of town. I've been working with Lindsay Fox for 20 years. So we're not just the top end of town, mate. We are number 3 Collins Street. We're right at the top. We are right at the top. So just be a bit careful about all this stuff, about top-ended towns. But do you think that a young person trying to save their own home, for their own home, trying to pay the HECS off with an effective net tax rate of over 40 to 45%, that's the right tax system when, if I'm very wealthy, then what I do is I transfer my income into capital and I pay the maximum 22.5%. It doesn't seem to me to be the best tax system. It doesn't seem to me the fairest tax system. But if you're in the business of tax reform, don't be in the business of using tax reform to increase expenditures. Tax reform equals tax cuts. And I know some people in the Labor Party don't quite like this argument, but if you're in the business of tax reform, you've got to accept that a marginal tax rate of 49% is simply too high. And the marginal rates are too high. If you want to shift the tax burden, shift the tax burden, but do it as tax reform. Could you imagine Bob Hawke? Could you imagine Bob Hawke? And if you could imagine Bob Hawke, which I can't, could you imagine Paul Keating coming on and say, I've got a great idea, tax reform, and I've decided to increase and change all these tax rates, and by the way, I'm going to spend it all. They wouldn't have thought that for a minute. Not 1 second of their political life. Tax reform equals tax cuts. Hawke made it absolutely clear. Paul Keating more than once to me made it absolutely clear. I've got to tell you, I went there and I said, here's the ACTU tax cuts. He said, give us a look at them, Bill. He said, have a look. He said, yes. He said, is this what you want? I said, yes, this is what the ACTU wants. He said, well, give me another look at them. He said, you want me to do this? I said, well, we do, really, yes, we would like you. So he took up the tax cuts, he threw it in the rubbish bin. And I won't tell you what he said, can you guess what the adjectives he said? So I went back and they said, how did you go with Paul? I said, not very good. So what do you mean not very good? I said, I went there and I gave him our tax cuts. He basically told us that he didn't like them. He said, that's no way to treat us. We've got an accord, an agreement, an understanding. I said, no, he did make this point. Perhaps you don't like this point, is that they're in the business of government. They're not in the business of opposition, they're actually in the business of government, and the tax cuts have got to get them government. They've got to win power to do things. And I went back and all our tax reform committee, which included members of the Communist Party who would have a fight and love having a fight, and they all sat there and we were getting beaten until Laurie Carmichael said, when you think about it, it's probably right, isn't it? You actually got to win government to actually do things. And that was it. We can build upon and make this country better. We can do it and make it a much, much better country. If we still have in our veins and in our belief and in our passion the sorts of things that Bob had and Paul had, things that they believed in and argued for. It's called a Labor agenda. It's called what you do for Labor. It's called the third way of working with people in order to create a better country, a much better country. There are things for this nation to do that we learn. And part of that is growth. Unequivocally growth. Now, Hawke had a vision of growth. Growth is not some fancy term that you look at it and measure the GDP in money terms, and then you say, I've got the GDP, we've now got to use a discount factor to get the growth up. Growth is what a nation aspires to produce, what a nation aspires to pay for. That's what growth is. If we're growing in health and education, and we're growing in environment, and we're growing in terms of the defence capacity of the nation, if we're improving people's living standards, and we're making a better society, that's what growth is. It's not some artificial limitation which says growth is terrible because the green people don't like it or environmentalists don't like it, because it's as much about their growth as anybody else's. As much about what they want as anybody else's. You can grow an economy. The environment is as part of the economy as anything else. It's part of what people aspire to. But the economy's got to grow a bit faster and a bit better, and we distribute it more fairly. People laughed at Bob about education. But you think of education in the 80s, you think of the universities, 300,000 people going to universities, 300,000 people going to universities. The Stollard shows, run by very conservative people, there's over 1.2 million going to university now, we just checked. An industry created of itself, for itself and by itself. One of the most important industries in this country. So growth is about those things, aspiring to be in those things. That's what growth is. It's something we shouldn't be ashamed of. Can you grow an industry in terms of the environment? Of course you can. The solar power industry will be the number one industry in the resources. At some point in the next 50 years, it will be the number one resource industry. It doesn't mean all the other industries disappear, but growth is about aspiration. It's about what people want and what they will pay for. And that's growth. So we shouldn't be ashamed of it, and that's what we should aspire for, and that's what we should distribute. So let me just come to the last two things. The last two things that are Hawke's unfinished business. Labor winning was one of them. We can win. The Labor Party will win at some point. But it will only ever win into the next generations of Australians if there is an understanding and a commitment that the Labor agenda counts, that it is compassionate and it is fair and it is about economic growth and it is about economic productivity and it is being distributed fairly and equitably in terms of health and education. That is what Labor is, and Labor is not just spending money. Labor is not zero productivity. Labor is not taking the big end of town. Labor is not about those things. A moderate party that went the third way a very, very long time ago. And Labor Party can and will win when that becomes unequivocally the agenda and understood by Australians. So let me come to the last two. Now it's very emotional. It's very emotional for me, because you sit with a hero of yours who's dying. And you've known him in part for a very long time, and you've had your arguments, you had your fights, and you listened to him, and you say about this person right at the end of his life, now what is it, Bob? What is it you think's most important? And he says, there's two things unfinished in this country. The two things unfinished in this country is climate change and the treaty. Well, you know, it affects you. It gets to your heart, mate, I tell you what. Really, really does. So, a person dying is one thing. Dying with dignity, as Bob did, is another. And that's wonderful in a sense. But dying with unfinished business and still understanding it's unfinished business is yet another. This country had a wonderful opportunity. I've got to tell you, I was so happy. Now, Kevin Rudd was not my, I've never been in the industry of palaver or giving out false credit. I'm not that sort of person. So I don't want to pretend for one moment that Kevin Rudd was, that I was on the top of his list or he was on the top of my list. I don't want to pretend that. He was not my sort of person, really, and I couldn't quite understand him. And I never could from the first time I met him, and I don't think I ever will. But it was a tragedy for this country when Kevin Rudd and Turnbull reached agreement on climate change, when 70% of the Parliament said we're up for it, and we get knocked over. Not Labor Party get knocked over, but we get knocked over. And I tell you a thing, in retrospect, the Labor Party's never won since. We got a minority government once, but we haven't won since. We gave all the technical reasons and all the personal reasons and all the words we like and all the reports, but we've never won since. We never won since because Kevin Rudd correctly said this is the biggest moral issue facing this country, the biggest moral issue facing the generation, and in response to that we said we're not going to do anything about it. Sorry, we can't do anything about it. It was a tragedy. It truly was a tragedy. Because climate change is not Labor Party. Climate change not Liberal Party. Climate change is not Green Party. It is actually the people of this country, the future generations. That's what it is. And none of us are more important than anybody into the future. And we were so close. We were so close. And we lost it. Hasn't served the Labor Party one iota of good. One iota of good. We've never won properly since. We've got a cobbled together minority government, but we've never won since. And the last week you sit there and if you are emotional and if you are committed, just think. A young, game, brave young woman in New Zealand goes to her parliament and says climate change is an issue beyond us individually, beyond us in terms of political life, and we should, as a parliament, work together to get a result. And she does. And she does. In Australia, what do we have? We have the low road. We have the very lowest road. In the midst of all the death and destruction, what we have is people blaming one another. People blaming one another about the deaths of people, pretending that's a real debate. So as a nation we confront. We can look in the last week at the high road of political strategy and social democracy is working effectively, setting aside the divisions in New Zealand, and we can look at Australia, the very lowest road. The very lowest road of political opposition. This is no place for us to be. This is no place for us to be. Hawke would not be here. I'll tell you what Hawke would have done. Hawke would have convened Parliament and he would have said, this is beyond me, beyond Labor, let us work together. If you didn't reach agreement, you say, I'm back tomorrow, we'll work together. If you didn't reach agreement, say, back tomorrow, we'll work together. If we didn't reach agreement, we'll be back together, we'll work together. We will work together to get a result until we get a result. And we will do it putting our political allegiances aside. Because the political allegiances are important in developing our code, but they're not greater than us. They're not greater than a nation. And I saw him do it 100 times in industrial disputes. You would sit there and say, can't reach agreement. It's not you can't reach agreement, you will reach agreement. When Bob and I had our arguments, he says, no, the difference is not good enough, Bill. The difference is not good enough. I'm not going to accept the differences. Go away, think about it, come back. We will work to get an agreement. When we still had arguments, they're not good enough, Bill. You've got to come back, we will reach agreement. Because people dismiss this view. They think that agreement making is easy. They think that Hawke view of life is easy. That in some sense you can have consensus, you can have agreement making, and it's easy. I tell you what, it's not easy. It's very, very hard because you've got to carry an argument, you've got to carry people, you've got to reach agreement, you've got to stand up and say, that's the best we can do. But that's what we're doing. And Hawke was the champion of this, the champion in the history of this country at this. Working, respecting, arguing, fighting. And he was brilliant. He was brilliant, mate. I've got to tell you. From the day I met him, from the day I talked to him, he believed in this. Numbers are important to win a position. He didn't care whether he got the numbers by 1% or one vote. He actually was not that, he got the numbers, you got the numbers. But when it came to doing things, he believed in the proposition of a discernible majority. That is, you had to get sufficient strength and weight in order to get sufficient strength and weight to get things done that lasted for a long time, you had to get wide political support. So if you wanted Medicare cemented into the system forever, you had to get it locked into the economic system so that the employers realised if they didn't have Medicare, then we'd be knocking on their door asking from employers. So you had to get the employers on side and wanting Medicare. You had to get half the Liberal Party saying, actually, they do put the hand up for that into the future. That power of the discernible majority, working to get. So he didn't move from left to right to centre. Left candidate for presidency, right candidate for Prime Minister. It mattered not to him. The power of the discernible majority to get things done, to work together with other Australians, to get a majority so that you could carry it in a debate and you could carry it in the field. That's what Hawke did for this country, and we lost it. We've lost it in part, and it is so sad. It's just so sad. The last is the saddest, of course. It is the saddest. Indigenous people were very important to Bob. They always were. We sat on the ACTU many, many occasions, and we talked about the most important things to do in life, the things you want to do most. And Bob always talked about the treaty. He always said, Bill, I'm not out there promoting it, but when I get the opportunity, when I get that opportunity to lay my gloves on real political power, I want to do something of significance. Now, he did it in multicultural Australia. He hated the two stains on the Australian community and politics, the White Australia policy. So when the White Australia policy became up for debate, I sat there in the lodge one night. I'd taken my son Michael, we sat in the lodge, talked to Bob, and people had been ringing him all day and said, Bob, you're losing this issue about multicultural Australia. You're losing the issue about the Chinese staying. It's actually hurting you. It's actually really hurting you. So I said to Bob, what are you going to do, mate? He said, I'm waiting my opportunity. And it's not that he hated, actually quite liked John Howard. I've got to say, he actually quite liked him. He said, I'm waiting for John Howard to overstep, mate. I'm just waiting for him to overstep, and when he oversteps, I'm going to reconvene Parliament. I'm going to make it an issue, not about John Howard and me, but it will be about John Howard and me. It'll be about multicultural Australia. And he said, I'm going to win that debate in the Parliament of this country, and I'm going to stab. I'm going to put to death the White Australia policy, and I will enjoy nothing more in life than that. And of course, that's precisely what he did do. And he did beat John Howard. They replaced John Howard with Peacock. But he did believe in it. But he believed as strongly in Indigenous rights as he did for multicultural Australia. And that is, of course, what he couldn't do. That, of course, is what he couldn't do. It's not that he didn't try, but to produce change, sometimes at the top, without producing at the bottom, without getting the campaign working, without convincing people, sometimes the task is too hard. Not because he's not good enough, but we weren't good enough. We weren't out there supporting him and getting it built, as we're trying to do so many things at one time. We didn't give him that support, and we didn't win. When Bob left, he was still waiting for the results in terms of the response, in terms of what he wanted in terms of the treaty. And his last day in office was the saddest day, and he cried, and I even think Paul Keating cried, and I cried. Not for what we did for Indigenous Australians, but for what we didn't do. But it didn't mean this. It meant that Paul Keating was absolutely committed. That's what it meant. It meant that Paul Keating would do land rights. He wouldn't win a vote in Australia. No marginal seats gains, no marginal seat strategy, but it didn't mean that under no circumstances would he ever have a tear for what he didn't do. What he didn't do. Now, the treaty is an important part. As I said at the outset, I can never understand why it is so hard to say to people who've been here for 50,000 years, thousands of generations, that we respect you. Respect your ownership. Respect your contributions. We admire it and believe in it. Respect your care for the nation. Respect your culture. We respect that. I can't understand why it's so hard. The treaty will come. The treaty will come. And the treaty will be serious. It will be about recognition. It will be about representation. And it will be about recompense. It will come. It will come when Australians say yes, that we believe in it. We respect your culture. We understand it. We will learn from the best in the world. We will learn from our own past and our own failings. And we will work to it and achieve it. Victoria will have it. Queensland will have it. Universities will have it. Unions will have it. And people in both sides. Both sides. And there's nothing Labor or Liberal about this. There is nothing Labor or Liberal about it. We'll support it for what it is. A statement of a nation that finally makes its mark. Finally settles the biggest questions that has stained its past. That has stained its past. You know, we were champions of Nelson Mandela. Nobody fought harder than us. Nobody fought harder than us for Nelson Mandela. Nobody fought harder than Bob. They were terrible, these disputes. They were so hard. They were so hard, so tough. And we were hurt. And we hurt. And we hurt people to fight for Nelson Mandela. And he said, when I get out of jail, one of the first countries I will go to is Australia to thank you. And he did. And he did. And it's the most wonderful day in your life to meet a hero like Nelson Mandela. But at the end, he asked the hardest question I've ever heard. He said, why is it that you fought so hard for me and fought so hard against apartheid, but you don't fight so hard for your own Indigenous people? It was true. It was true. And it was hurtful. Our job is not to do the treaty. Our job is to put our hands up for the Indigenous people of this country and say, you negotiate the treaty, but we're with you, and we will support you, and we will fight for you, and we will respect you as this country does the treaty. And when we do the treaty, the country will be one step better off, and it will be its own independent nation, and we can put our hand up and say with a sense of pride that we have made progress and done a substantial thing. That's what Bob said, remember, in 1980. He tried as hard as he could, and he failed. He's never been so sad. I never saw him so sad. It wasn't that Paul Keating beat him. This happens in political life. Being beaten by Paul Keating is not the worst thing in the world. He's a pretty hard fighter. What hurt him most was unfinished business. And what did he say? He saw me, I must say, probably on Paul's side in that battle. I never really was. not that I don't love Paul. I truly, truly love Paul. And I'm a great admirer for him. And I've never hid it. But I truly love Bob too. And I've never hid that either. Never hid that either. So in the aftermath of it all, I said to Bob, so you did the best, mate. You changed the world, changed Australia. You know, I would have liked you to head off to the ILO, you know that. So you could have actually changed the world. But that's another story. So what is it that's most important to you? He said, I said that the most important thing for me into the future, the most important thing for me into the future is that you take up the issue of Indigenous people. You take up the issue of the treaty and you win in the end. You win in the end. Now for Bob, that's important because we'd had hundreds of discussions in the past about winning in the end. You lose a lot of battles in industrial life, you lose, and you fight again, and you win. You win in the end. You win a better wages system, you win a better superannuation system, you win a better healthcare system. We had the biggest industrial political disputes in the history of this country over Medicare, but we won in the end. We won in the end. And when you win in the end, it is not that we win as individuals. You win as a nation, and you win the respect that the country has. If I had any commitment, gave any commitment to Bob, is I think the last bit of my breath, I'll be arguing for the treaty, arguing for Indigenous people. But I will most of all argue for the legacy and the history of, I think, the two greatest people in peacetime Labor Party, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. I just believed in them so much. I believed in them so much. In conclusion, they made this country better. They did a power of good. Bob did a power of good for this place, and he made the place better. He gave steel to a social structure, and he gave form to a social objective. Labor Party will win again when they are warriors of Hawke, and they are warriors of Keating, and they believe in those things passionately and persuade Australia. Then we will be a better country, and we will make the country. For Bob, all we can ever say is thanks. I don't know how many discussions we had. I don't know how many arguments we had. I don't know how many disputes we had. But the one thing we always did was we did our best. And of this people, in this country, at this forum, this country, with the same sense of enthusiasm, the same sense of belief, and the same commitment that Hawke gave to this country, we will be better off. Better off because of him, and we'll always be better off for him. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bill, for your take on a vital part of Australia's history as a growing nation. Your insight, and thank you for your passion. I do hope that David Morgan watches this online and just has that little sting again that he had those years ago. Paul Keating was right when he said that you know how to round up the intellectual bits into a coherent story and tell a compelling whole. You stood beside giants among men, the former Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. And together, you created a new economic order that prepared Australia for the 21st century. Thank you, Bill, for tonight giving us a glimpse, a privileged glimpse, into such formative times in the recent history of our nation. And thank you for your timely reminder that we still have much, much more to do as a nation to deliver a truly dynamic economy, a better country, and true reconciliation. Thank you very much for your oration tonight, Bill. Now, as you all know, Bob was associated with the University of South Australia from the very beginning, back in 1991. And in 1997, we established the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre as an active public programme, a research institute and a Prime Ministerial Library. At the time, Bob said, I will do all I can to help make the centre an institution of which we can all be proud, not as a memorial to an individual, but as another small but important bridge to understanding, compassion and good policy. Bob delivered the first Annual Hawke Lecture in 1998, and it was entitled A Confident Australia. And he established a tradition of excellent insight that has been sustained by a series of outstanding speakers in the years since. And Bill, you joined that legacy here tonight. In all those years, Bob only missed 2 of those lectures. In his masterful oration tonight, Bill told us of Bob's genius, of his larrikin spirit, and of his compulsion to win. I too encountered those traits from time to time. I remember one morning in 2014, Bob was sitting on top of the Hawke building on a bench, and he was smoking a cigar. And he was clothed in blue smoke, and I walked out to see him because you're not allowed to smoke in the university. And I took out my authorised person's card and I said, Bob, you see this? This authorises me to tell you to stop smoking. He took a big drag on the cigar, and he looked me in the eye and he said, it authorises you to let me smoke. I would like to thank the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, its Executive Director, Jacinta Thompson, for organising tonight's event, the magnificent team behind the scenes who've made it all work. And I want to remind you all that a video of this lecture will also soon be up on the Hawke Centre's website, so you can share it with people who weren't here tonight, and you can watch it again yourselves. We owe a most special thank you to Bill Kelty for sharing these stories about a man who loved this nation and was loved in return by its people, the Honourable Robert James Lee Hawke, AC, GCL. May he rest in peace, that he so manifestly deserved, and perhaps with an authorised cigar in his hand. There is a memorial book in the foyer for you to sign tonight before you leave, and a copy will be sent to Bob's family as a token of the esteem we hold him in from the Hawke Centre, from the university, and from all of those who have recorded their tributes. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and safe home.